How's it going, everyone? Hopefully, you're able to hear me all right. So, today, what's up, Karan? How's it going? So, today, folks, we have just a few things to wrap up with World War II. I pretty much have made it to the end of the war, not quite. We're going to finish up the last little bit of it. I did talk about Hitler being killed. That's what's called VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. That's May 8th, 1945 is the end of the war. So it runs from September 1st to May 8th, 1945. And then the war against Japan, from the American perspective, continues after that. For another couple of months. Now, in April of 1945, about a month before, not even a month before, wait, is it 45? No, I'm sorry. In 44, April of 40, no, that's not right. It is 45. April of 45, Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies. He has, I think, a massive brain aneurysm or heart attack or something, some natural cause of death. But he was in ill health. FDR famously, if you don't know this about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he didn't have the use of his legs due to an illness that used to be rampant back in the early 20th century called polio, which can leave you rendered completely disabled. It can be fatal, but anyhow, he didn't have the use of his legs. But on top of that, remember, he's living in a time where like smoking is prolific and stuff like that, and so he's just not he's not a healthy dude, and he dies. And so when he dies after his third re-election, but fourth election that he won, excuse me, he is replaced by the vice president, who is Harry S. Truman. And Harry S. Truman kind of takes the reins for the last little bit of World War II in terms of America's involvement. Meanwhile, the war in Japan has been waging on. They're doing something called island hopping warfare in the Pacific after the Battle of Midway puts an end to the Japanese expansion of the Pacific front line, if you will. What ends up happening is that the Americans start making their way closer and closer and closer, literally hopping using planes from island to island to get to subdue the Japanese forces on islands that they had taken. And there were some famous battles in the Pacific that you guys should probably have some awareness of. The Battle of the Coral Sea is a big one. Battle of Midway is probably the most important. Battle of Guadalcanal is another major one. Maybe you've ever seen the picture of the... I wonder if I can find it here. Let me see if I can find this image. You've probably seen this picture before. This is from another famous battle. Let me pull this up here. You guys ever seen this photo before? Here, let me put it over to my desktop here. You guys seen this? That's the Battle of Iwo Jima. That flag there, that's a very famous picture if you've never seen it before. And that's from the Battle of Iwo Jima, and that was on the island of Iwo Jima in the Pacific. That's fighting against the Japanese. And that hill there on Iwo Jima that they're placing that flag is one of the more prominent features of the land on that particular island. So yeah, that's the battle. That's after the Battle of Iwo Jima that they are putting that flag up there, and you can see here's another image after it's placed. But yeah, one of the most famous pictures probably ever taken of the American Marines. So anyhow, there's that. So that's Battle of Iwo Jima. Battle of Okinawa is another big one. That's really close to Japan. And these battles ultimately result. Now, the United States never does a land invasion of Japan because in the place of a land invasion after Hitler is gone, there's a meeting. Now, that's really the point of today's lecture, which is not going to be very long because really I've kind of gone ahead a little bit of where the documentaries are, and you're going to be resolving World War II today. I didn't want to give you too much work over the weekend after I gave you that vocab assignment on Friday. By the way, the reason I was gone on Friday is because I had to migrate my whole college class from Schoology over to Canvas. I got an email from the Dean of Instruction saying that Schoology is not in compliance with their distance learning whatever. So I had to take and put my whole college class on Canvas, and that was really annoying because obviously they more or less do exactly the same thing. But anyway, whatever. Point being that that's what I had to spend my day. Actually, I got that email on Wednesday, so on Thursday and Friday that's what I was doing. But so I needed that time to do that because they needed it done by May 1st. So anyhow, today resuming and concluding World War II. Now, one of the things that we need to talk about today is something that we haven't addressed too much to this point, and that is there are several diplomatic negotiations that take place during the war, and I want to talk about some conferences that took place that were very important to characterizing what happens next after World War II concludes, because we're going to be in a brand new global era after World War II. Really, the world is going to change significantly after the end of the war. The war characterizes very much a turning point where we see the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as a global power. Being that the two powers were on the same side during World War II, it might be a little bit confusing that almost immediately when the war ends, those two powers are going to become global competitors against one another to establish the new order, new global order of the post-World War II era, which is going to be defined by something called the Cold War. And that'll be what we learn about next. Now, in order to understand or characterize how that relationship develops between the United States and the Soviet Union, we need to look at some of the conferences that happened during the war, because these conferences very much set the tone for how the United States and the Soviet Union will interact with one another after the war. Now, keep in mind, their roles in the war are very different. The Soviet Union, being that it's in Europe, faces the direct onslaught of the German military for years, and they lose tremendous numbers of people. When we talk about the Soviet Union's losses in World War II, we're talking on the level of about 25 million people were killed from Russia in World War II, which is by far and away the highest number of any single nation that participated in the war. Now, take that number, 25 million, and compare it to the number of Americans that were lost in the war, which is roughly about 300,000. Now, 300,000 is no small number, okay? 300,000 is a considerable number of people who lose family members, sons, husbands, brothers, nephews, uncles, you name it, cousins, okay? And so there's a lot of people, but 25 million people is a huge, it's an astronomically huge number. It's so huge that if you were to look, in fact, let me pull this. I bet I can pull this up too. Population, if you know what a population pyramid is, USSR. I want to show you this here. This is really important. Okay, this is important to look at. All right, look at this. Look at this. Look at what happens here. Watch this. Let's put this over here. Check this out. This is what's called a population pyramid, and what it does is it looks at numbers of people at a certain age over time. Okay. So what we're seeing here is a population pyramid probably from about, the mid or late 90s, somewhere in that neighborhood, maybe even a little bit later than that, maybe about 2000 or something. I want to show you the population of men and women. Now, of course, women die too during the war, because in Russia, because it's kind of an odd thing. You might think that Russia, being so conservative, is going to have really conservative gender roles, but actually it's almost exactly the opposite. Because Russia is so oppressive of its people, men and women actually are the value of life is so low in Russia that it's kind of like they don't care if it's men or women losing their lives for the state. Okay, so it's an extremely oppressive system in Russia, and so there's a lot of women who die in the war as well. But look at what happens here. This is the population at about the year, probably, like I say, 2000, when World War II vets would have been between the ages of about 70, 75 years old. Okay, maybe even a little bit earlier. Just bumped on 95, 98, somewhere in that neighborhood. So the vets at that time who were still alive in Russia, okay, you can see a major dip in the number of people. Now, the average age in Russia, the life expectancy starts declining rapidly after about 65 years old. People die in Russia a lot earlier than in other places. So by this point, there's very, very few people. But you imagine if you were to go back to the World War II times when these people were younger down in this region, you would have seen a significant divot right here in the side where all these able-bodied men lost their lives in Russia. This is a very abnormal-looking population pyramid if you know anything about demographics, because what ended up happening in the war is that there were so many people that were killed, 25 million people killed in the war, that it actually ends up having a ripple effect, an echo effect in the population pyramid, where people from that generation, literally there's just not enough of them alive anymore to re-regulate the population. So you see generationally here a huge echo in the number of people born, and we may even see a third echo. So in other words, the lingering population effects in Russia are still recognized and measurable even today. Maybe this is a more recent one even. No, that one looks older. But it's extremely apparent. And if you don't have enough men, the women that are then alive don't have a partner and thus don't produce children. And so, marriage rates go down and childbirths go down on a generational level, where there just simply aren't enough people being born to resupply the population. Pretty interesting. So let's switch over and talk a little bit about some of these. Let's talk about some of these major conferences that take place during the war. Okay, the first one that we need to talk about is something called the Casablanca Conference, and that happens in 1943. This is where Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, Roosevelt's still alive in 43, and Churchill, they meet together and they determine at that meeting that a course of action. Number one, the Axis powers are going to have to surrender unconditionally, meaning that they cannot make terms. The victors of the war are going to be the ones who dictate the terms of peace once again to the subdued powers, meaning Germany, Italy, Japan. Those are the Axis powers in World War II. And at that conference, the Casablanca Conference of 1943, they also determined at that time that Italy would be invaded first before opening up that new front in Normandy with D-Day. Now, here's the thing. Stalin was really, really upset by that measure. And the reason that Stalin's mad is because he wants assistance fighting the Germans from the west, to draw troops away from the east. Russia had been facing the German troops almost completely single-handedly. The entire force of the German Wehrmacht went against the Russian military for 1941, 42, 1940, 41, 42, 43. Really, it's not until halfway through 43 where the American and British forces start invading up through southern Italy that the fascist forces have another front to fight against. But remember, because they're invading through Italy, there are German troops stationed in Italy, but there's the Italian troops stationed in Italy as well. And Stalin never really forgave the Allies for this at the Casablanca Conference, because it ensured that the Russians are now going to have to continue to fight the brunt of the German army basically entirely alone, because although there are some Germans in Italy, there are far more Italians in Italy than there are Germans. And so Stalin doesn't appreciate FDR and Churchill's plan of attack at that conference. Shortly after, the Casablanca Conference is in 43. Shortly after, also in 43, that's the first time that Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin really meet together, and they're sometimes nicknamed the Big Three: Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, the three major leaders of the powers, the Allied powers fighting against the Nazis and fascists in World War II. Now, it was at the Tehran Conference. Tehran is in Iran. It was at the Tehran Conference that the Allies agreed to finally open up an invasion of Western Europe in 1944. Now, Stalin at this meeting is appreciative finally that they're opening it up, but for him it's too little too late, because there have already been such devastating losses at the hands of the Germans, from the Russian side of things. So Stalin at this meeting tells Churchill and Roosevelt that he is going to enter into the war against Japan once Germany is defeated. So they have an agreement: Germany first, get rid of Germany, and then we can focus on Japan. And Stalin says, "Oh yeah, like I said earlier, I will help in committing Russian forces to Japan." Now, he also insists, which by the way he doesn't do, but anyway, he also insists on Soviet control of Eastern Europe and carving up Germany amongst the Allies after the war. So when they finally submit Germany and Germany surrenders, Stalin has a vested interest in carving Germany up to prevent them from being able to wage another attack in the future, a World War III, if you will. Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. The idea here being, look, we let Germany bounce back after World War I. Stalin says, "Oh, it's going to be over my dead body that I'm going to allow a German state to bounce back after a Second World War." And now, 25 million deaths of Russians. So Churchill says, no, we can't just allow all of Eastern Europe to be controlled by communist Russia. So Churchill demands free governments in Eastern Europe and a strong Germany after the war, because Churchill says, look, Stalin, don't be a fool. The reason that Germany bounced back after World War I is precisely because we punished Germany. If we hadn't punished Germany so badly after the war, they perhaps would not have had this resurgent nationalism that allowed for the Nazi Party to take hold in the first place. If we had supported Germany as an ally and welcomed them into the sphere of European politics, maybe Germany wouldn't have gotten mad in the first place. So they're both legitimate arguments, right? Stalin says, look, we don't want another Germany that we appease, okay, because appeasement didn't work. We also don't want to punish Germany so bad that it causes them to bounce back to fervent nationalism and fascism, so that we see another angry Germany. So there's going to be a debate about what happens with Germany after the war. Now, ultimately, they do decide to split Germany up after the war. They divide it into 4 sections among the Allied powers. Now, France gets a little bit there. I oftentimes don't include France as a quote-unquote Allied power because of the number of French collaborators there were at the upper echelons of government and politics. Government and military in France at that time. There were many French collaborators that worked with the Nazis in the Vichy France, controlled state or occupied state, puppet state. That was the word that I was looking for. Puppet government. Okay, but generally speaking, the French kind of get to, because of their resistance efforts from Charles de Gaulle and stuff like that, they kind of get to, get their name as an honorable mention in terms of the Allied powers. But remember that France falls really quickly, and you don't really know, kind of like the Italians at the end of the war, you never know which way the French are going to go. If it seems right for them at the time, they might collaborate with the Nazis. If it seems wrong for them at the time, they might not. You never know which way the wind is going to blow with the Italians and with the French at the tail end of the war. But anyhow, point being that they do divide Germany into 4 different sections. There's a USSR section, a United States section, a British section, and then a smaller French section. Now that division lasts for a number of years, I think 4 years. And then after 3 or 4 years of kind of militarily occupying Germany in 4 different zones, the British quadrant and so on, the Western powers, America, Britain, and France, say, look, it's time that we pull our troops out of Germany. We don't need to have a military occupation there. They are utterly defeated. They hold trials at the end of the war called the Nuremberg trials to prosecute war criminals who had committed crimes against humanity with the Holocaust. There are a number of these trials that bring in high-ranking military figures and political figures from the Nazi regime to collect evidence and hear testimony and so on. Many Nazi high-ranking officials are hanged. Some of them escape. Famous story of Joseph Mengele, who was kind of this mad scientist doctor of the Holocaust who had done all of these perverse experiments on people, twin studies, namely medical experiments where they were testing the extremes of what humans can handle, things like cold, or trying to do, radical experiments of trying to change people's eye color and other things like that. Many people horribly abused by medical malpractice during the war. Mengele escapes, I believe, to Argentina, as a number of other kind of mid-ranking Nazi figures did. In fact, even today in Argentina and some other places in South America, you will find almost exclusively German villages that speak German, have German restaurants, and a lot of them are descendants of escaped Nazis from World War II. There was a story back in 2000, maybe I'll say 10 or so, 2011. There was a story of when Google Earth was first starting to become really popular, Google Maps, Google Earth. There was a Google Earth image of a picture looking down at Earth's terrain in Argentina. And it's one of these German communities situated in the hills in a remote area where they're very isolated. And at the bottom of this guy's swimming pool was a giant swastika. And that made the news, and I saw that. And it just goes to show you that there are still some of these sentiments still alive today. So, Tehran Conference, to jump back to that a little bit. The Tehran Conference is the first meeting of the Big Three. Stalin says, look, I promised to help out in Japan. He does not end up coming through on that promise, but then the war in Japan does end relatively quickly. Stalin also insisted on Soviet control, and Churchill says, no, we're not going to let you control Eastern Europe. Because remember, as the Soviet army is now systematically, slowly but surely pushing the Germans all the way back to Germany after the Germans had invaded Russia, the Soviet military is now taking over the places that the Germans had occupied. So the Soviets are marching right over those same lands that the Germans took over, and now the Soviets are saying, "Look, you're under our control now. We're militarily occupying now. The Germans are out, and you'll listen to what we have to say." Now, how this translates in the Cold War, of course, is that a lot of these Eastern European nations fall for a long period of time under Soviet control, and Eastern Europe becomes highly, highly communist because the Soviet government sets up puppet governments in all of, or most of, Eastern Europe, and this becomes really the characterization of Europe for the Cold War, because Europe becomes very divided. You have a Western Europe who's very democratic, and then you have an Eastern Europe that's Soviet controlled and thus very communist. And so this is going to be significant, and this is why we're talking about these conferences right now. Now, Roosevelt kind of tries to act as a mediator because he thought that he could work with Stalin to achieve a post-world peace within the construct of a brand new global United Nations. This United Nations platform would be an opportunity for nations to come together and avert war, get over their nationalism, and start to work more in the framework of globalization and collective security. And that's what the whole purpose of the United Nations is to prevent global wars from breaking out for no good reason. It's a platform, it's a forum for diplomats, ambassadors from various countries across the globe to come together and discuss and resolve issues without resorting to war. So it's a good idea, and the United Nations does have some problems with it, but nonetheless, this is where these ideas are coming out, and Roosevelt really has hopes that he can work with Stalin. Now, of course, maybe Roosevelt was a little bit idealistic and overly optimistic, because Stalin is a ruthless, cutthroat military despot. And he is not a guy who keeps promises. He will as soon stab you in the back as he will make you a promise. And so Stalin's not one of these guys who's probably going to be an easy person to negotiate with, but Roosevelt thinks that he might be able to find some middle ground between Britain and Russia. Now, the next major conference that happens between the big three, and probably the most famous and important of all of the conferences in World War II, is going to be called the Yalta Conference, Y-A-L-T-A, Yalta. The Yalta Conference takes place in 1945. Now, this conference is the last major meeting that FDR takes part in. He dies just a couple weeks after the Yalta Conference takes place. Now, it was in this war that Stalin says, "Look, I promise to help you out with Japan, but give us 3 months." Which I think is probably, you could pitch it two ways. You can say, from a historical argument, you could say, look, see, yet another example of Stalin not coming through on a promise. However, keep in mind they lost 25 million people. So to have 3 months to have some time to bounce back or reallocate their forces from one side of Russia in now Eastern Europe and Central Europe all the way over to the Pacific, 3 months seems like a pretty reasonable request. Okay, now what they didn't know at the time was that the war would be over within 3 months. So there was that after Germany is vanquished. But at the Yalta Conference, he says, we will help in the Pacific, but give us 3 months. He also agreed, and this is going to be a major sticking point for Truman when he takes over after FDR dies. Stalin agreed to a declaration of liberated Europe at the Yalta Conference. He promised at that time that the Soviet Union would not occupy Eastern Europe after the war. This is a promise that he is not going to keep. All right, so he says that he agrees to it, but he is going to go back on that deal almost immediately. Also, the Yalta Conference is where they really set the start date for the United Nations, because the first time that the United Nations is going to meet is going to begin in April of 1945. Now, we will talk more about how the United Nations works when we get into the start of our Cold War unit, okay? I'm not going to go over that today because it's not important for understanding the tail end of World War II, but it is good to have an idea of how the United Nations operates. And so we'll talk about the United Nations when we get done with World War II and we start the next unit. So just sit tight on that explanation. It was also decided at Yalta that Germany is going to be divided into occupied zones, and I mentioned that earlier. And then a coalition government of communists and non-communists was agreed to Poland. You know, in other words, for Poland, now that Poland is once again going to become a country after the war ends, the question is, what kind of government are they going to have? Being that Poland was kind of torn between two sides, they agreed at Yalta that they would have both a communist and non-communist government in Russia, which sounds kind of weird, because how do you have a communist government and a non-communist government? Because communism usually results in single-party rule, but whatever. Once again, it doesn't really matter because Poland is in Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europe falls under the control of the Soviet Union, which makes it all communist anyway. So the USSR was allowed to keep its pre-1939 territory at this conference. That's what they agreed to prior to the end of the conference. They say that after the war, they will go back to their 1939 holdings, and then FDR accepted Soviet control of Outer Mongolia and some other places. Now, the next major conference happens a few months later after Roosevelt dies. And when Roosevelt dies, Harry S. Truman takes over. Truman, a staunch anti-communist, is not going to trust Stalin. He's not going to try to work with Stalin, at least not in the same way that Roosevelt is going to. And it's at the Potsdam Conference, after Germany is defeated, they hold a meeting in Potsdam, which is just outside of Berlin. And at the Potsdam Conference, which once again, the big leaders show up to this one, except for now we've got some new names. So Truman took over. So now Truman's going to show up as one of the big three. Stalin shows up. He's still the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. And then now Winston Churchill actually got voted out as prime minister. So at the Potsdam Conference, which takes place in July of 1945, like I say, that's about 2 months after Germany is defeated. The new British Prime Minister is a guy named Clement Attlee, Attlee, Clement Attlee, and Clement Attlee is it, or maybe it's just Atlee? Sorry, Clement Attlee, new leader of Britain in Parliament, the Prime Minister, and it's at this conference that Truman makes up his mind about dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, unbeknownst to Russia at the time, and unbeknownst certainly to Japan at that time, there was a secret project going on called Project Manhattan, or the Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project was the development of a nuclear bomb. Now, the way that a nuclear bomb works, in essence, is it's kind of interesting. It's based on the principle of nuclear fission. So I am not a physicist and I'm not a chemist, so hear me out. When you get up to elements that have higher atomic numbers, the number of electrons floating around the atom can vary. There are different isotopes of higher atomic number particles, and there are certain isotopes of these that are more stable, and then there are some that are less stable. And one of the things that makes radioactive things radioactive is that these electrons will fly off, basically at the speed of light. And they produce what's known as gamma waves. And these gamma waves are are radioactive and they are deadly. They penetrate all living fiber and can cause some serious problems. And so here's the idea. If you were able to take a bunch of if you were to create a bomb that contained a fuel source of this radioactive material with all of these unstable isotopes, what will happen is if you put them into close enough proximity with one another and one of those electrons goes flying off into another atom, it will cause that atom to explode, and thus all of the other electrons will then blow up and go flying off into different directions into all the other atoms that are in there, which causes a simultaneous, instantaneous chain reaction where all of these atoms are essentially exploding at the speed of light. And it produces a phenomenal amount of energy, a huge amount of energy. Now, the atomic bombs that were used in World War II were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, famously. Those are, to this day, the only time that nuclear weapons have ever been used in wartime is at the tail end of World War II. And to be honest with you, the bombs that they dropped were, by comparison to the ones that they start building after World War II, tiny little baby bombs. So to consider the fact that these two bombs were dropped and instantaneously killed about 100,000 people in each city demonstrates to you the power of such a weapon, and that those are small ones is almost frightening. Now, an interesting fact about the atomic bombs that's worth mentioning: how come they didn't pick a city like Tokyo? How come they picked smaller cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Well, simply put, by the time that they dropped the bombs in August of 1945, there was basically nothing left of Tokyo. See, one of the things that they started using in World War II and was used extensively in the Vietnam War is something called napalm. Napalm is a gelatinous, gasoline, flammable substance, kind of. It's like a petroleum kind of product that when you drop napalm on a place and light it on fire, it sprays everywhere and causes massive fires to break out. And they use napalm, amongst other things, in the Vietnam War to burn down jungles so they could see the ground better to fight against the Viet Cong. But in Japan, the reason that they use napalm is because most of Japan's infrastructure, homes, buildings, and so on, were made out of wood and paper products. So napalm was particularly effective in Japan. And actually, one thing that a lot of people don't know is more people were killed by the fire napalm bombings across Japan than were killed by the atomic bombs. Now, the atomic, I'm not excusing the atomic bombs. There are definitely questionable human rights issues with the use of atomic bombs, because for those people that aren't killed instantly, they're exposed potentially to radiation and other things that could cause cancer in the long term, or birth defects, or horrible scarring and other things like that. The thing that you have to understand is there's actually, when an atomic bomb is dropped, the way that the atomic bomb works is that they don't just drop it from a plane and let it land on the ground and blow up. They detonate the bomb about a mile above Earth's surface, about 5,000 feet above Earth's surface. And the reason that they do that is because it will have a much higher blast radius if you blow it up here. Okay, that blast radius is able to spread a farther distance to the land below. Also, if you detonate it in the sky, a lot of that radioactive material stays up in the atmosphere and doesn't spread as much on the ground. If you were to drop, like the reason Chernobyl was so bad is because it happened at ground level, and all of that radiation was just right on the ground and being kept in by the atmosphere. But if you blow it up in the air, a lot of that radiation stays up there. Not all of it, but some of it does. And then only the immediate area below the bomb is affected. If you were to blow it up on the ground, all of the energy is going to go up because the ground is going to absorb the energy from the impact of the bomb. And it's not going to have as much of a blast radius. So that's how the atomic bomb works. Now, moving on to go back to a little bit to the Potsdam Conference and talk a little bit more about that. The Potsdam Conference, Stalin, Truman, and Attlee, Clement Attlee, new prime minister, meet at this, and it's at this conference Truman secretly orders the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan. He kind of had what Truman didn't realize is that there were Soviet spies in on the Manhattan Project that were able to escape America and bring this secret information back to Russia. So at this conference, Stalin doesn't have knowledge of how to use an atomic bomb or develop an atomic bomb, but he's going to soon. And it was at this conference that Truman issued a public statement, very public statement, addressed directly to Japan that said, "Surrender now, unconditionally, or face utter destruction." And of course, Japan didn't know what that meant because they didn't know that they were developing an atomic bomb at the time. Now, the Manhattan Project actually was to develop 2 atomic bombs, and they had names: Little Boy and Fat Man. These were the names of the bombs, and they were designed slightly differently. And the reason that they developed 2 was because if they had only developed 1 and dropped it on Japan, there was a chance that Japan may not have believed that they had another one. But once they drop a second one, now all of a sudden Japan is forced to ask themselves, wait a second, how many of these things do they have? Now at the time we only had 2. There was a third one that was on the way, but it was not completed yet. So if they hadn't surrendered after the second one, who knows what could have happened. But the general consensus, modern day consensus, I would say, on the use of the atomic bombs in World War II is that probably it did save lives. See, what you have to understand about Japan by the end of the Second World War is that Japan, being an island and being relatively devoid of natural resources, but particularly devoid of the most important natural resource for a modern military at that time, which is petroleum, they were really, really, really low on gasoline. So what we started to see the Japanese do towards the tail end of the war is they would have their pilots fly planes only one direction, directly into the ships that they were attacking. So the Japanese were doing what were called kamikaze missions, where they would directly fly their plane directly into... Whoa, I almost spilled my coffee, which is what I do every time. But anyhow, they fly their planes directly into the ships, and they were doing these suicide missions, and these soldiers, of course, die in the process. So the Japanese, think about what Truman's asking them. Surrender unconditionally. What do we know about the Japanese culture? They don't even have a word for surrender. It's the most dishonorable thing a person can do, is to surrender, and they are absolutely unwilling to do so. They are diehards. They're warriors. They don't want to surrender no matter how bad it gets. They'd rather fly their planes into the side of a boat than to surrender. It's getting serious. And the general consensus at the time is, unless we had a real devastating show of force against the Japanese, they are not going to change their minds about this whole surrender issue. So when we dropped the first atomic bomb, that was on August 6th, 1945. After that, we waited 3 days. In that 3 days, Japan did not surrender. And then we dropped the second one on Nagasaki. And it was after that one that they agreed to terms of surrender. So the Potsdam Conference was where those bombs were chosen to be used by President Truman. It was also at this Potsdam Conference that Stalin flip-flops on what he had said at the Yalta Conference about allowing Eastern Europe to be free. So by the time that July 1945 comes around, Stalin has changed his tune. He says that Eastern Europe is not going to have free elections, that the Soviet military will remain occupied in Eastern Europe, and and that's the way that that's going to be. So he goes back on what he had promised to Roosevelt just a few months earlier at the Yalta Conference. It was also at Potsdam that they started to negotiate other things like how are the war crimes trials going to take place, how's demilitarization of Germany going to take place, how's denazification of their government going to take place, and so on and so forth. And then the idea was that because they're going to divide Germany into 4 separate regions, that the reparations from those regions that were occupied by the Allied powers, the British, the Americans, the Soviets, and the French, that reparations could be taken from those places. In other words, they would be able to extract materials and things to help them pay for the war. So that's the Potsdam Conference, and that's the last major conference before the war ends with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. Now, Japan, when they surrender basically it's 6 years to the day after Hitler had invaded Poland in 1939. So it's now, that was September 1st, September 2nd, 1939, and now the Japanese are surrendering aboard the USS Missouri September 2nd, 1945. So that is the conclusion of the World War II unit. Couple of last few things that I want to mention here. Results of the war. Human losses, about 55 million people total were killed during the war. And when you keep in mind that 25 million of them came from Russia, that should tell you something. The Holocaust resulted in the deaths of about 5.5 million Jews and 5.5 million other people. Millions of people after the war are left homeless. Millions more have to be relocated, particularly those Germans that were living outside of Germany. Much of Europe is in absolute ruins. If you thought that World War I's devastation was bad, World War II takes it to a whole other exponential level, because remember, World War I was all of that stalemate fighting in eastern France on the Western Front, and there's destruction there and stuff, but there is far more destruction than there was in World War I after World War II. Much of Europe is going to take years to rebuild because of the amount of just absolute, utter chaos and disorder from the nonstop bombing of places for years on end. Women played an even larger role in the war economy in World War II than they did in World War I. Remember, all the features that we talked about with World War I were every bit as true in World War II. We talked, you might remember, we learned about total war and women going and working in factories and all of that sort of thing. All of that happens even more in World War II than it did in World War I. All of the propaganda, all of the, all the stuff that goes along with total war, the government taking over private organizations and things like that, lots of governmental control of private business during that time. The United States and the Soviet Union, of course, after the war, emerged as the two global dominant powers. Britain is no longer the British Empire has lost its seat on the throne as being the most dominant force on the planet after World War II. It is now going to be a global situation characterized by the competition, conflict, competing world ideas of communism and capitalism between America and Russia after the war. So, and that's going to take the first place that we're going to find that takes the stage is in rebuilding Europe. To what extent is Europe going to be rebuilt by the Soviets? To what extent is Europe going to be rebuilt by the capitalist democratic governments that participated in defeating the Germans? So this is going to have a major effect on what happens next. Now, why did Germany lose the war? Well, they were fighting on 3 fronts. You had first the Russian front, then the Italian front, and then the French front. And the German army was stretched across the entire continent. Germany, not being particularly large or having the number of people that Russia does, is not able to continue to resupply their military when some of their higher ranking and better skilled military units are killed or destroyed in battle. And then eventually they just start running out of soldiers and running out of bullets. They're running out of supplies as well. And they start resorting to using children, like kids, basically adolescents, 12, 14-year-old boys to fight, and then like elderly men. Major blunders, of course, the major blunders to remember are that Britain was allowed to maintain intact. Hitler changed his sights away from Britain after 1940, and the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy were able to bounce back significantly. Invading the Soviet Union was a big mistake. Another big mistake was trying to go for Stalingrad after having already secured Kiev. Hitler's declaration of war against the United States could be considered another major blunder, although I don't know that it would have made as big of a difference, because I think that the United States probably would have entered into the war anyway and helped Britain out before defeating Japan. Also, the German industrial capacity just isn't going to be enough to compete with America, Britain, and Russia. I mean, the Germans were amazingly advanced in a powerful industrial economy, but they're still only Germany. And no matter how much land they took over, a lot of that land that they were taking over was in Eastern Europe, which was lagging in industrialization. The U.S. was just simply able alone to outproduce all the Axis powers combined. And so once America enters into the war, it's pretty much game over in terms of industrial competition, because America is just, by pure numbers of people, just way, 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 way bigger. And so that's a major factor as well. A lot of the Germans' economic and political and military energies were focused on the Holocaust, the final solution. To take care of the racist nationalist agenda of the Nazi Party, and it's likely that if they hadn't had that entire racial bend, that evil crimes against humanity that they were conducting for years and years and years on end during the war, it's likely that they could have committed a lot more of those economic resources to the actual war front and maybe had a little bit better chance, or a fighting chance. But even still, the mere economic Goliath of the United States would have been really difficult for the Germans to keep up with. And then too, remember that the Germans really don't shift their economy to a total war-style economy until later than they should have. And by that time, they were already being outproduced. The Axis alliance kind of proved to be somewhat of a liability. Italy had failed in Greece and Yugoslavia and drew Germany into the Balkans. And if Italy had been able to kind of secure just the Axis alliance in general, just Hitler never really cared much for Mussolini. By the way, when Italy gets invaded by the Americans, Mussolini is strung up by his own people in Rome, and his body is dismembered and mutilated. And so Mussolini dies. He does not make it to the end of the war. He was executed in 1944. And particularly after that, Italy is out of the war anyway. And then Japan's attack on the U.S. really is what drew Germany into the war in the first place. So if Japan had exercised restraint in attacking the United States, it's possible that the war in Europe would have gone on longer as a exclusively European event, and that and it's possible too that China would have faced even crueler treatment at the hands of the Japanese, who had conducted, for example, the rape of Nanking in 1937, which resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of innocent Chinese men, women, and children who were literally raped and murdered by high-ranking Japanese officials. And by the way, the officials that conducted that horrible crime were also hanged at the end of the war. And then the Grand Alliance between Britain, America, and Russia was just overwhelming. And then you had 40 other countries in there as well, and all of them were working together for the unconditional surrender goal at the end of the war. So that brings us to the conclusion of today's online lecture. I am going to be putting up episode 6 of the Apocalypse World War II documentary and the assignment that goes along with that. That will be your online instruction and assignment for Wednesday. I hope that you found today's lecture informative and interesting. And of course, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. You can either ask them right here, right now, or you can shoot me a message on Schoology and I'll get back to you and let you know what's up. But for right now, I think that that will conclude today's lesson, about an hour's worth of lecture, and you can go ahead and watch the conclusion on Apocalypse Episode 6. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.